the Redmond Historical Society and the community of Redmond for inviting me to, giving us the opportunity to do this project and for me to have this, this venue and this platform to come back to the community where we made this discovery and tell you about it. We've been working on this project for a long time, about 7 years as far as our involvement, and as the mayor noted, this project's been going on for quite some time. It's nice to be at a place where I can give these public presentations. This is the first one. We've been busy. The digging part of it, the part of it that a lot of you probably noticed if you've gone to the mall or along the parkway, that's been over with for a while now. We've been analyzing our data. We're working on doing technical reports and working with the different consulting parties as the finished product, although I went out for the first time today out to the site, and first time in about a year, and it's great to see the project actually come into fruition. Just a show of hands really quick. How many of you have been past the site and saw it in the newspaper, know about it, been by it? Okay, yeah, it's pretty good. It is hard not to, a lot of the times we do our work, we don't publicize it because there's always the chance if we find an archaeological site that with the knowledge of where it is, it might be eluded or damaged somehow. This is a very visible site, so this was a challenge in a way because it's right along the bike path, and the community takes a sense of ownership of that path and the community, and so this has been a pretty interesting project. My goal in this talk is to not only tell you about the Bear Creek site and why it's important and its significance, but put it in the context of how we found it. I think it's just as important for the community to know what went into the discovery of the site and how we investigated it through that process as it is the actual technical details. And I know that there are a couple professional archaeologists in the crowd, and if you want more technical information, you can either do the Q&A or you can come up to me afterwards and we can talk about that. But I wanted to give an overview of why this is important, because this discovery happened during a very routine environmental compliance project for the city. And this happens all the time at the local, at the state level, at the federal level. This kind of work happens. Now, it rarely results in the discovery of a site like what we found, but this happens all the time. So I think it's really important that you understand that part of the process as well. Let me, without trying to turn everything off, okay, the laser pointer works. So those of you who've been by the site, just on the south side of Bear Creek Parkway, I noticed it's now, it looks very different than it did before. You might have seen it in 2008 as a heavily vegetated stretch of that bike path. And maybe you saw some archaeologists, one or two at a time, digging some small holes to try to figure out what might be there. You might have come by in 2009 and seen a big open area that had been graded a little bit, and archaeologists working in funny little 10-meter intervals digging holes. That was when we were doing our testing, when we had discovered the site and we wanted to try to find out a little bit more about it. Well, when we found out the significance of the site, and I'll get to more into that in a minute, which happened then, it took a couple years for the city and the different agencies that were involved, the tribes, to figure out how to move forward and still have this project happen. And so in 2013, you might have gone by and seen lots of people digging, and not just people, archaeologists, but also construction workers at the same time, the summer of 2013. And then this is what it looked like right afterwards. Like I said, I haven't been back in a year, so I didn't have a photo of it. I wish I could, because it looks very nice out there now. Okay, so to situate you, why, I want to give you kind of the one or two sentence summary, and if you've read that Seattle Times article, I think we conveyed it there. Why is this site so important? Why is the Bear Creek site so important? It is the oldest archaeological site with stone tools that has so far been investigated by archaeologists in the Puget Lowlands and in kind of the Washington Straits region. This star is where we're at right now. It's also the Bear Creek site. And all of these other yellow dots are locations of discoveries of something really old. Most of these are older than 10,000 years old. There are a few sites, archaeological sites on this map that are a little bit younger, but what they all have in common is that they're old. Now, another thing that they also have a lot in common of, with a couple exceptions, is that these are artifacts that were found by a landowner, by a farmer, by a collector, somebody who found, say, a spear point that is clearly diagnostic. That's a fancy word for we know what time it came from or who the people were or what it was used for. Diagnostic of being older than 10,000 years old, which gets us back into the end of the Ice Age and that transition from the Ice Age to more warmer climates by about 10,000 years ago. And most of these dots represent somebody finding like a single spear point. And that's really interesting, that's cool, because assuming that it was left there by the people who made it or used it and it wasn't brought in from somewhere else, that's information that people were around that long. And of course, Native American oral tradition, they've been here for that long, that's pretty obvious, but here we have some material evidence of that as well. Now, you can't say too much more about that with those discoveries. They're interesting. Those projectile points that we call them, the spear points, a lot of them are what we call Clovis points. Those are artifacts that are time sensitive. We know that they're older than 10,000 years old, but when they're taken out of the ground like that, we can't get too much more information. So to be able to find those kinds of artifacts in place in the ground and all the dirt around it and their spatial relationships with each other, all these artifacts, tells us a whole lot more. And that's only happened in 2 other instances in the Puget Lowlands. And both of those sites don't have stone tools. The first one, if you've ever been out to Squim and been to their little historical society museum, you might have seen a little diorama of some people butchering a mastodon, and that's based on a 1979 excavation by Washington State University. They found the remains of mastodon at a big archaeological site that also has more recent stuff, more recent stone tools, the remains of bison, things like that. But the curious thing were these mastodon bones, and in one of the ribs there was a piece of bone stuck in it. And that's always been kind of an enigma. Ooh, these are people, this is finally a chance to excavate a site, and this mastodon might have been hunted and butchered by people. And it remained kind of an enigma. It's a bone stuck in another bone. And then in 2011, some scientists at Texas A&M University, they kind of hit it with a big science stick, and they did ancient DNA analysis, and they radiocarbon dated the material, and it's over 12,000 years old, and it's a mastodon, which isn't too surprising. The bone stuck in it is a mastodon, but it's still equivocal. It's like, did people hunt this, or how did this bone get in here? There's one other site that was excavated a little bit more recently on Orcas Island, and it's an extinct form of bison. And we call it the Ayer Pond bison. That's the name of the pond where it was found. And the archaeologists there, once again, they didn't have stone tools to look at to help complete the picture of what people were doing. It's just the skeleton of a bison, and it's over 12,000 years old. They knew that, and they looked at the way the bones were fractured and what parts of the bison were still there and what parts were removed to try to infer human hunting, butchery, that kind of thing. And they make a pretty good case for it. But it would be so much easier if they had artifacts to go with it, or cut marks on the bones, things like that, and they didn't. So the site that was found in 2008, and that we found out a lot more about in 2009, is the first site in this area that is that old and that has stone tools. And you can see here the talk about that the mayor gave about taking the channelized stretches of these streams. It's really important for salmon to put those meanders back into them. And back in the middle part of the last century, that was the thing to do, was to channelize these streams, get the floodwater out. It made sense back then. People didn't realize the kind of effect they'd have on salmon back then. It's hard to see Bear Creek right here, but you can see stretches of the Sammamish River that look unnatural. They're awfully straight, like up here to the north, and some areas along Merrimore Park. So we were brought in 2008 to do, once again, a very routine cultural resource survey as part of the general environmental compliance plan at the state level for the city. And we knew that there was a pretty good chance of finding archaeology, because if you know anything about the history of Merrimore Park, there's been a lot of archaeology that's been conducted at the park. That area of Merrimore Park has been intensively occupied by Native Americans for at least 5,000 years. We've got archaeological evidence and probably going back much further. So we were looking at first, before we even went out there and dug a hole in the ground, we knew that there was a pretty good chance of finding archaeology because we're just right over the freeway, over 520 from that area. And it's a great place to be. It's always been a great place to be in terms of once the glaciers are treated, it's been the confluence of smaller streams and larger streams. It's been right at the north end of a lake that's been around that was formed because of glaciers. There are these, you look at if you're somebody who likes to go hiking or outdoorsy and you look at topographic maps and you see that little swamp sign right there, like at the north end of Miramar Park, and you think, ooh, I don't want to go hiking that. Well, if you're living on the land and living from the land, that's a great place to be, actually. So knowing that that area has changed so much, we thought, well, there's a pretty good likelihood. And not only that, but there might be archaeology, artifacts buried really deep. And you don't have to go back too far. This is, for those of you, this is the Historical Society after all. Many of you probably seen this map. It's the 1897 USGS map. And it shows Redmond when it was very different than it is today. Just a little dot on the Northern Pacific Rail line. You can see that before 520 was there, the lower 3,000 feet of Bear Creek was very different as well. So we knew going into this ahead of time that we might find artifacts and that the dirt, the ground, may be very, very different than what we see today, and that we need to keep an eye on that. So we developed what's called a survey protocol. And like I said, this is very routine. This particular area was maybe not quite so routine because it is so close to known archaeological sites, but we knew that there might be artifacts found deep. So we used a combination of digging by hand. You see archaeologists out there, you think of shovels and screens, but we also incorporated some use of backhoes, which may not be what you think about when you think about archaeologists with their toothbrushes and their trowels working very carefully. We had to find a balance of being able to get down to those deeper sediments, older sediments, and try to get down to all the cobbles and gravel that was laid down when the glaciers moved back, when they retreated at the end of the Ice Age. And that big lobe, the Puget Lobe, that formed the Puget Sound, that really shaped it and scoured it out, that retreated back north about 16,500 years ago. And it laid down all this dirt. And that's a great place to stop digging. We get asked as archaeologists a lot of times, well, how do you know where to dig? Well, this was obvious. We had to dig where they were going to put in the project. But another important question is, when do you stop digging? And when you hit that layer of dirt, that particular kind of dirt, we can stop because it's very old, and anything before that would have been pulverized, moved away. And so we use backhoe trenches, little ones, to get down that deep. And we were still kind of in that, oh, this seems to be pretty routine. We're getting confirmation of what we think is going on. The dirt that we saw was sand. We call it alluvium. It's an indication of flooding, and that's just what happens in river valleys. Those sands pile up every time there's a flood, and it doesn't represent a place where you would have a good stable landform to make a camp, make tools, hunt, fish, gather, whatever. Or if it is, it would have been washed away by later floods. So everything we saw here showed that it wouldn't be a very good place to necessarily camp, or if it was at one time, it's all been washed away. We found a really interesting sequence of dirt, and I'm kind of hammering home the dirt. I know it's not maybe the most exciting part of the archaeology, but it's that context. It's kind of cliche, but context is everything. It's not just the artifacts, it's the dirt you find them in. And it was a very interesting kind of a layer cake of different kinds of sediment that we saw, and we found a couple artifacts. So we were kind of excited. Once again, this is kind of making us realize, okay, well, it's good that we did this careful look and this careful survey strategy, because there are a few pieces of stone that have been chipped. We call them flakes, and they're not diagnostic of a particular time. Anytime somebody makes a stone tool that involves chipping, they're going to chip off what we call little waste flakes, or debitage is the French word for it. And we found some of those, and that was interesting. And they were at the bottom of a layer. Now, don't get too caught up in this is just the profile drawing that we do of one of those trenches. And you can see this kind of this layer cake, and these are our geoarchaeologist conventions that he wrote down for the different kinds of dirt. And the important thing was that at the top, there were these flood sediments, this alluvium, which is what we expected. Below that is this thick layer of what we call diatomaceous earth. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of that. It's really good to put in your garden if you want to kill slugs. But that forms in an environment where the lake level, Lake Sammamish, was really high. Sometime in the past, Lake Sammamish covered the city, what's now the city of Redmond. And these little, what are called diatoms, single-celled critters that are covered in a silica shell, they live, they thrive, they die off, and that diatomaceous earth piles up at the bottom of the lake. The lake level moves back, and we're left with this. And then down here is a layer of peat. The mayor mentioned peat. I mentioned that in my article. This peat was pretty amazing. And you can see it's not very thick, and then here is the bottom of the trench. Our geoarchaeologist was crouching. It's about 4.5 feet thick right there up to the surface of the ground. And this is a little bit misleading. That was one of those stone flakes that we found. And it was right at the contact between the peat and the diatomaceous earth above it. Now, once again, we were forming amongst ourselves a working model of, well, how old is this stuff? Is it important? We find with somewhat regular frequency, especially in places like this where there's a known intensive Native American habitation, you find things like flakes and occasional formed artifacts and whatnot. So we were trying to figure out a little bit more about this, and using what we know about Merrimore Park across the freeway, that was kind of the model that we had to go on. And over there, this exact same, not exact, but a very close pattern, that layer cake pattern of sand over diatomaceous earth over that peat, has been seen in archaeological sites since the 1960s. Bob Gringo of the Burke Museum at UW would hold field schools in the 1960s where he'd bring college students, and that's where they'd learn how to do archaeology. Merrimore Park is one of the most well-studied places in King County, so we knew really well that sequence. It's very familiar to anybody working in the area. So when we saw this on the other side and some flakes, we thought, well, this is probably a peripheral part of this big Native American village site occupation that went on for thousands of years. Once again, not too surprising. And the peat in the park has been radiocarbon dated to about 3,000 years. So that was, once again, our working model. Well, just to be sure that what we were dealing with, we took radiocarbon dates on the peat over here, because when you're looking at the ground and you saw that older USGS map, those stream channels change, things change. We wanted to be sure that what we were looking at. And much to our surprise, this is our first surprise during this project. And don't get too, once again, this is how our geoarchaeologist shows those layer cakes kind of exploded and color-coded and everything. Just look at the magenta. The magenta is that peat layer. And the top of the peat came back with a date of about 9,000 years old, and the bottom of the peat about 10,000 years old. So before, with that little flake resting on top of the peat, that's what we call an earliest limiting date. So we knew that assuming everything piled up and didn't get jumbled around, that flake wouldn't have been any older than about 3,500 years, because it's sitting on top of when that peat was laid down. Well, when we got those dates back, that earliest limiting date got pushed back to about 9,000 years. The stone artifacts that we were finding could be as old as 9,000 years. Suddenly that became much more interesting, because as I showed you on that previous map, we don't have many at all sites that are all that old, older than about 5,000 years in the Puget Sound area. We also got a clue that there might be older material as well. The King County Roads archaeologist sent me a photo from the archives from Bob Gringo's field school in the 1960s. And this was a photo he took when he was in the field school, and a local resident brought him this projectile point, some kind of spear point, to show him. And as you can see, the records he took, Sammamish River near Bear Creek, 1940, at about 18 inches down below the surface. And this is really cool. This isn't on the records, the state database, the points on the map kind of thing, because it's not exactly clear where it was found. But most critically, you look here, and he did a good job of getting the shadows right. You can see it's really finely flaked. And one of the last flakes that was made on this tool is right up here. Somebody took from the bottom of that spear point and hit off a nice long, what's called a channel flake or fluting. And that's what we call diagnostic of some of the first people who were living here. That channel flake is, it's commonly called Clovis, and it's what people think of associated with the mammoths and the mastodons and people hunting those. So I'm not sure where that projectile point is. I'm sure the person just wanted it photographed, feel pretty good about it, and then took it away. But it was nice to see that too, that there's some indication. So we went back to the city in early 2009 and said, okay, we need to check this out a little bit more. The site boundary, the two ends of where we found those couple stone tools, happens to coincide with where the city was planning on digging down a little bit anyways, and not quite down to where that contact was, but pretty close. So we figured we'd piggyback on their work. We didn't find any artifacts above that, so we had them dig down, and here you can see, it's amazing what a backhoe can do. You think about a bull in a china shop. If you talk to the backhoe driver and you explain to them how to remove the dirt, and you have them use a bucket that doesn't have teeth, you can move dirt, You can move dirt a few inches at a time very carefully. And so we had archaeologists out there as they were removing the dirt to make sure we weren't missing anything and get down to right above that contact. And we were going to find out more about that. That was our goal. And so here we are working in these little 10-meter intervals. We dug these 1-meter diameter test holes. And this was our second surprise. Well, we didn't find in the 80 some odd test holes we dug any artifacts at that contact with the peat and the dirt above it. Once we were able to get in there and not be limited to digging in a trench where you couldn't see very well, it was, oops, I'm giving it away here. It was clear that there was actually another layer below the peat, a thin, sandy layer below the peat and above the glacial outwash. So it was easy to get down to where we could stop digging. That reddish-brown dirt right there, that cobbles, you've probably seen it in exposures around here. That is the remnants of the glaciers dropping the sediments that were on them. So that's about 16,500 years old. And so you can stop digging there. And you could see the peat and the diatomaceous earth above it. We were getting really nice exposures in places. It's hard to see here, but there's kind of a lighter streak right above the peat. And that's an ash layer from, we call it Mazama ash. And that's, Mount Mazama was what Crater Lake was when it, before it blew its top about 8,000 years ago. And it had such a huge plume of ash that you find it usually on the east side of the state where it's drier, it gets preserved more. But it was amazing to see it really well preserved here in the wetter side of the state. So that marker, that's about an 8,000-year-old marker. But the thing was, we were finding things such as this artifact the very first day below that peat and above the glacial outwash in that thin layer. And then we realized, well, what we're looking at here, because peat is great. Peat is nice because it's, the peat represents an old wetland. It was a wetland environment, and when the vegetation dies, it gets compressed, and you can tell if that peat has been disturbed after having been laid down between 10 and 8,000 years ago. And below that peat, it's kind of like a security seal, basically. And so below that peat, we were finding those tools. That's the tip of a projectile point. It's broken, the base is missing, and we were hoping to find more. And sure enough, we did. Now, this is exciting. This is when we had to go back to the city and say, look, what we're onto now is something really significant, because instead of being maybe as old as 8,000 years ago, we're looking at something that is older than 10,000 years ago. And still to this day, nobody's found another site like Bear Creek. It's going to happen soon. I hope it does. But this is significant. And the city was understanding. They were a little bit unsure. Well, what do we do next? It's like, well, let's finish doing our testing, because we might find something that is diagnostic in this scatter of stone artifacts covering an area about 200 meters buried underground. Now, I talk about diagnostic, so this is what we found. These are diagnostic. These may not look all that impressive to you. They're two rocks that have been formed, and these are the bases of projectile points. So let me go back a second. Tips of projectile points are cool when you find them, because you know, oh, it's a pointy thing that was probably used to put at the end of an arrow or a spear or a dart, something like that. But no matter what, through time, it's only going to work if it's shaped one way, pointy. So you find lots of tips of projectile points because, well, you think about when people go out and hunt, you're going to break your tools, or if you're butchering an animal, eventually the tip of that projectile point is going to be somewhere in the animal, and it finds its way out and into the archaeological record. It's the base of the projectile points that's exciting, because that can tell us a couple different things. It can tell us, well, was it an arrowhead or a spear? Was it used to put on the end of a spear? They also tell time, and certain aspects that don't contribute to an arrowhead or a spear point working well are called stylistic. And it's not clear exactly what the reason was for people making little indentations or concave bases up on the bottom sides of their spear points. But the cool thing is, at least in the archaeological record of Puget Sound, that particular style isn't seen. It's seen east of the Cascades in eastern Washington in archaeological sites that old, but nowhere in Puget Sound do you see projectile points similar to this. Everything later in time looks different. Some of them are what we call leaf-shaped, like willow leaf shapes. There are projectile points with notches and stems and things. These are just totally different, and it's a different kind of material. So we knew that we would find something like that. We also knew that this is really the first site of its kind, so we should be ready for anything. And that's the point of testing. So in 2009, we were trying to get as much different kinds of data as possible on the site. It's a bit cliched, but you only get a first chance, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. And knowing that the site is old, we wanted to be really careful and get as many different kinds of data as possible. Not all of the site was nice and secure. I mean, a lot happens in the past 10,000 years. It's going to change a landform. And certainly when you're in a river valley, you're going to get flooding, and the lake levels are going to go up and down. There's the occasional volcanic eruption that lays down tephra. There are earthquakes that we're all familiar with too. And that changes the dirt a lot, and that can change our context. So we were really happy with the artifacts we found under peat with that nice stratigraphy. There's a middle part of the site where at some point later in time, sometime over the past 10,000 years, or probably 8,000 years, since the end of that peat formation, where flooding came through, the channel of Bear Creek jumped and it scoured away the middle part of the site. And here you can see that layer of peat, not only has it been scoured down onto, but on either side of this 3-meter hole we dug, those sands that represent flooding sometime later go all the way down to the glacial sediments. And all we're left with in this particular patch is a little bit of the peat, and everything underneath it was left in place, but everything over it. So it's really, I mean, it's up to the chance of nature to preserve a lot of this stuff. And these are some of the stone tools we found. Once again, you find a tip, it's really cool. Some of these are, they're made of different materials, and these were provisional identifications that we made when we were looking at the stone tools in 2009. All cleaned up and pretty. These are the 2 projectile point bases that we found, and they look prettier when they're wet, especially this one down here. It's kind of a striped stone, and once again, it's not the most, you don't see it very often in other artifacts from later times. Now, I said before, now you can tell a lot of things from stone tools, you can't tell everything. It'd be nice to know what people were eating, and a site like this, because it's peat is really acidic, and it's not the kind of thing where you're going to find lots of bones. So whereas it's great to have a site that's different from the Manus mastodon and the bison, where you've got skeletons, but no stone tools, we've got kind of the complementary thing going on here. We've got a pretty interesting set of stone tools over 10,000 years old, but not the bones of the animals to go with them to tell us what people have been hunting and fishing and things like that. Well, we did because we knew that we were dealing with something pretty unique. As we were collecting the stone tools, we were using gloves and putting them in foil and trying to find stone tools from the most secure contexts, and we sent them off for protein residue analysis. And that is, I'm not going to go into the details of the technical details, but the residues that are left on stone tools, if they survive, and oftentimes they don't, and they survive less and less the older they are, but if you can extract some kind of protein residue, you can compare that with modern specimens and not figure out exactly what that residue came from, but get a good idea of a general different sense. And so in the Seattle Times, it's always a trick. You want to get people excited, but you don't want to overstate what you find. This was pretty cool. However, it is just one stone tool that had the remains of animal residue left on it. And it had 5 different kinds of protein residue that appear to be related, for one thing, to modern bovine, cow residue, which 10,000 years ago would have been bison, bear up here, what we call artiodactyl, which are like deer and elk, that general category of animal, sheep, which was probably either bighorn or mountain sheep, and then what I got most excited about, because this is, after all, work to be done for a salmon habitat project, there was actually the remains of some kind of salmonid fish. And now you can't tell if it's trout or salmon or char, but something in that general family of fish. And that was really exciting. So we had enough to go back to the city and say, this is a really important site. There are a lot of different data categories. The site is also important to different people for different reasons. And I kind of put this in here as a placeholder. The city wanted to continue doing the project, and to continue doing the project, which would damage part of the site, there's the legal obligation of the city and all the agencies involved in permitting and funding and everything else to make sure that the site is treated properly, and that everybody who is considered a consulting party can have a seat at the table to discuss how it should be handled. And because the site is so important, it took a little while. And something I kept reminding myself, and as the consulting archaeologist, I have to take a step back. I'll let them kind of sort it out. we proposed some additional excavations, and I kept reminding myself that this material's been in the ground for 10,000 years. If, a few more years is not going to hurt anything. So, 2013, joking aside, we weren't bored, even though my crew director Ross is yawning right there. We got to work. We were out there for about, how many of you saw us digging in 2013 and wondered what the heck is going on? We tried as best we could to answer questions, but it was hard. How many of you went to in May, the year, right before then, there was an Archaeology of the Curious program that the city put on. How many of you went to that? It was a smaller group of people. Okay. Yeah, because we knew that there would be questions. So there was a Saturday in May where I gave a little talk, my co-principal investigator Ken Ames gave a talk, the agency archaeologist talked, the tribes talked, the Snoqualmie and Muckleshoot tribe has been very involved in this project, and I should have said that earlier. They gave presentations, and so it was also an active construction site for almost all the time we were there too, so there's only so much we could do at the time. This is actually Aaron Webster. He's the Snoqualmie tribal intern. He was with us for almost the entire dig. He's actually gone on to do, I think that was his first big excavation, and he's gone on to do lots of other excavations as well. We had a similar attitude in this bigger data recovery excavation to get all the information we could before the construction happened that we did during testing. That because this is the first site of its kind, we better try to get as much information and not go overboard in any one area, but just to be safe. So we took kind of a conservative approach that way. We brought in a lot of different specialists. Here's Brandy Rink. She's one of my project geoarchaeologists, and she's taking what's called micromorphology samples. So her background is geology and archaeology, and so she took, at just a few places, these columns, she cut out a little column sample of the dirt that includes the archaeological layer and all the peat above it, and she would impregnate them with a resin and cut them into thin sections and make slides and look under a microscope at the really subtle changes that would happen over time looking at the dirt. Here I am with Ken Ames. Ken is my co-principal investigator. It's been quite an honor to have him along. He's a professor emeritus at Portland State University, and he's written the book, or one of many books, but written some important work and has done work for decades in the whole Northwest, and he's been able to help me kind of have a 10,000-foot view of what's going on. He's worked up in British Columbia, Southeast Alaska, Oregon, and it's important to kind of get that perspective. We took, because you don't just want to, what we do is we are trying to tell the story of what happened in the past from the material that's left behind. And when you have a window that corresponds with a construction footprint, you're not getting an unbiased view. Now, there are lots of other biases that enter into how we make our interpretations, how we tell our stories, but if you're stuck looking just in that corridor, you're going to get kind of a skewed perspective. So we did some work in Merrimore Park. We were able to get what are called geoprobes, which are really skinny diameter probes, and run those in a couple parallel lines through the park, because that layer of Lake Sammamish changed over time. And at one time, by looking at the diatomaceous earth, we know that it totally covered the site. At other times, there was a wetland, and so that fringing wetland, if you've been to like the dog park, it gets really swampy by the north edge of Lake Sammamish. Well, that fringe moved over time back and forth as the lake level changed and as climate changed, and it's interesting to learn about the people by looking at the stone tools, but it's nice to be able to put the people on the landscape and figure out what kind of environment they were living in, especially when you get back earlier than 10,000 years ago, because the environment changed really quick with the melting of the glaciers. We also had the opportunity to, use a couple different methods. Now, dating, radiocarbon dating, a lot of you probably know maybe at least a little bit about it, and it's not without its controversies. It works really well. We've been radiocarbon dating since, I believe, 1950, and the techniques have been strengthened, but we found our limitations in trying to figure out how old certain things were at the site, because radiocarbon dating, you date organic material, charcoal, bone, shell, that kind of thing. And we found a fair amount of charcoal. We didn't find any campfires. That's old hearths. That's the kind of thing where you get a radiocarbon date on a hearth. That's kind of a slam dunk. So we actually were able to get radiocarbon dates on different materials and different portions of the organic fraction using different labs. and it gave us much more confidence in our methods. And we also used a different method called luminescence dating. So this picture down here is the UW has a luminescence laboratory run by archaeologists, and that is totally unrelated to luminescence dating, where the crystal structure of certain kinds of sediments, when they're buried and they're no longer exposed to light, it starts a little stopwatch or a little clock in them. And if you go through the laborious laboratory procedures, you can find out how old things are. And it actually corroborated our radiocarbon dates, which was nice, but it also gave us a chance to date that channel event that appears to have happened about 5,700 years ago based on our luminescence dating. So a question that just we wouldn't have been able to answer otherwise was answerable because of that. Now this map here, this is a busy map. This shows all of the units that we dug. We dug about 425 square meters in the end, and those are the dark brown. The little squares are 1 meter squares, and the bigger squares are 10 meter blocks that we sampled within. We wound up digging a lot of dirt. And to kind of take you on a little quick tour, if you didn't have the opportunity to peer down into the holes, this is what they look like on the east end of the site, pretty deep. Now, this is where we had stopped in 2009, that level right there. And this is the diatomaceous earth, and you can see the peat is really thick. So, and that actually dates contemporaneous with the stone tools, roughly. So, at the time people were there making their stone tools, camping, this was still a wetland. So this is probably the edge of Lake Sammamish, or that fringing wetland at least, back between 10,000 and about 12,500 years ago. You can see there's some of that volcanic ash resting really nicely on top of the peat. And here we are hunkered down trying to get those done. Just about 20 meters, or about 60 feet to the east of that, or to the west of that along the corridor, is where we opened up one of our first big blocks. This is actually a pretty big area. Now we were hoping to find the remains of structures. What do people live in? Tents, post molds for houses. We were hoping to find some hearths, things like that. We didn't find any of that. And that's actually a problem that's common to almost every site that's this old that's excavated anywhere in North America. It's very difficult to find remnants of those structures. But what we did find was a very dense concentration of flakes and cores. You think about making an omelet, you have a lot of eggshells. The cores and the flakes, so a core is a rock that you're hitting other rocks off of, and you can use flakes that you hit off of that core to make stone tools, or you may just ignore them. They may just be your eggshells, so to speak. And we found a whole bunch of those of the same kind of material, this bluish gray, what we call metasediment, clustered really tightly in this area. So we dug a lot of that out, and that was a very informative area. A little farther to the east, this is where the flood took out part of the peat, that later flood. And you can see what happened. We didn't dig as many holes because why spend a lot of time doing that? It was very interesting from an alluvial geomorphology perspective, but that's not really what our big focus was. So just to show you what that looks like. And then you go a little farther, the western third of the site that we were excavating was a hive of activity because that's where we found most of our form tools and things like that. You can see by the time we got over there, this is sort of Murphy's Law with archaeology. You get the most interesting stuff when you have to be finished, like with a week left or something. And so you're rushing, and we were just, there's Ken and Ross, my field director. And here you can see the construction crew just waiting. They were putting in their dewatering wells. They were just waiting for us to be done. This white area here, and you might have seen this when you drove by at a certain point in 2013, that's the geotextile fabric. So all the part of the site that the city was able to avoid was covered by a layer of fabric and then fill put on top of that. And so that is ostensibly protected. So it's nice not to have impacts to that part of the site. We made the most of our information along this corridor that corresponds with the new channel corridor. This is just to show you one exposure where we were able to get more radiocarbon dates. We divided the peat layer, we give it a certain nomenclature, certain conventions for naming, Roman numerals and letters and everything else, but the important thing is what we called stratum 5C. That's that layer beneath the peat that has the stone tools that are in place. And in just this place, we took 2 radiocarbon dates, and they came back between about 11,500 years ago and almost 12,500 years ago. There are other parts of the site where we got radiocarbon dates, or as recent as 10,000 years ago, but nothing more recent than that. We did get some luminescence dates that are a totally independent method that also date them back to about 12,000 years as well. So that's pretty exciting. You don't have this opportunity. We've never had this opportunity before in this particular area. Not to kind of bore you with some of the other technical stuff, but we were able to, in 2009, we took a peat core next to every one of the holes we dug, and we kept them in 2 refrigerators in our lab until someday, someday our ship will come in and we'll be able to send one of these off for analysis, and we did to a place called Paleo Research in Colorado, and they took that peat core, they cut it into intervals, and they look at the pollen and the diatoms, so those little critters right there under a microscope, that's those little silica critters that make diatomaceous earth. And they tell you a lot about the environment. They looked at the plant material, and I won't go into too much detail here, except this is the kind of data that they generate. And this is time. The top is the top of the core. The bottom, this is where the stone tools are coming out of, this bottom layer here. And those bars just show proportions of different kinds of plant pollen. And while people were here making and using and disposing of stone tools, this bar here is pretty wide, and that's pine, probably lodgepole pine. And then after that, when there was a wetland, these are the peat layers, you see a decrease in pine and an increase in Douglas fir. So this is how we reconstruct what the vegetation was like. We're trying to use the dirt to reconstruct the physical geography of the landscape, and we're also using the plants. This is, so my background, as the mayor mentioned, I'm a bone archaeologist, animal bones. My background is called zooarchaeology. All of these stone tools are great. I rely on specialists to help me, in terms of the stone tool analysis. But when we finally found a bone, I was so excited, and we found one bone. We didn't think it was possible because of the preservation conditions. But we found a tiny little fragment in that block where we found all the cores and flakes under really good context, and so we know that it's older than 10,000 years old. And the shape of that, the texture, is indubitably salmonid. So to find a little bone of a salmon, it just seemed, I think that was the last quote that they put in the paper. It is kind of a full circle thing. I got so excited. My co-PI, Ken, he's been around long enough, he's seen everything. He's like, just settle down. This is just one bone. And it doesn't make actually a very good point. Lately in the press, and this is why when the Seattle Times calls me, I get kind of, you want to get people excited about what's being found, but you also don't want to overstate your case. And as archaeologists, we all have different specialties. Some of us are lithic experts, some of us are bone experts. And when we talk about something that we find, we get really excited. This does not mean that there were people intensively harvesting salmon. It is a very strong indication between this and also finding that residue on that tool that before 10,000 years ago, there was a viable salmon population in the Sammamish Basin. And fisheries scientists have no way to get back that far in time except looking at fossils that are like 200,000 or more years. I think they found sockeye salmon fossils by Lake Cushman that are much, much older, but they're not archaeological. So we actually have a data set here that falls in between and should be very useful for fisheries scientists as well. And actually, I got so excited, I sent that off to the WSU Molecular Anthropology Lab to get ancient DNA. It'd be great to find out, oh, is this Chinook salmon? We know it's salmonid of some sort. You can't tell from the bone what species of salmon. And Brian Kemp at the lab, he was so excited, he said he'd do it for free. So I was like, okay, well, it's normally pretty expensive. I sent it to him. He said it was unlikely because it's so small and we were not able to get enough ancient DNA out of it to tell what species. But it's exciting because where there's one, there might be more. Okay, onto the stone tools, and I realize I'm kind of getting close to time here. We found over 4,000. If you include 2009 and 2013, we found over 4,000 stone artifacts. Now, most of them aren't pretty tools like this one. They were the flakes, and some of those flakes are actually pretty useful as a cutting edge, but we did find over 4,000 of them. That was a sample we were hoping for, to be able for our lithic analysts to do some statistics to say, okay, we're seeing a pattern in the stone tools. Do we have enough of a sample to really be confident in that? And we did, which is good. These are some of the different materials of stone tool. Tool stone, and some of them probably came from a long ways away. The nicest stuff in terms of being able to create what you want out of stone by flint knapping is oftentimes material that comes from a long ways away. You think about obsidian as being one of the best types of tool. We didn't find any obsidian at our site. I would have loved it if we could have, because you can tell where that obsidian came from by doing chemical analysis. But the people here who lived at the site over 10,000 years ago had a really good idea of what kind of stone was available. And they saved the nicer material, the stuff that's better quality, the equivalent of like your fine china, for doing more specialized work and coming up with tools that need sharp tips. What I can't show you is the wear. You can look at, you can look through low power magnification and see the wear on tools, so you can see where somebody was using that tip to either carve something or drill something. There are cutting edges that show wear. There is a lot of material right under these people's feet. Now, I told you about those glaciers when they retreat and they drop all the cobbles and everything. That's a certain kind of material. Only some of that can be turned into nice tools, not all of it. So we looked at those. Also, some of the artifacts, when they're left in the ground for a while, can trick you. And this is not a Bear Creek artifact. I went up to Simon Fraser University, and it's amazing how little we actually interact with the Canadian. There are a few archaeologists down here who interact regularly with Canadian archaeologists, but I finally was able to look at an assemblage of spear points that were collected along Stave Lake, which is up in British Columbia. It's a tributary of the Fraser River. It's actually similar in a lot of ways to Lake Sammamish, and they have 12,000-year-old spear points. And they also have this interesting phenomena. When one of their points broke, you look at it on the inside, it looks totally different than how it looks on the outside. And that's a patina, or a weathering rind, that happens when, probably when these stones were left in the ground for so long. So we took some of our flakes. We didn't do this to all the nice artifacts, but a few of the flakes we sent off for petrographic analysis to figure out what is the chemical composition. And what we didn't chop in half were the what we call bifaces. This is what we call early stage bifaces. So you have a rock, you hit it with another rock or a piece of antler or wood, and you start making a sharp cutting edge. And you can either stop there and not put too much effort into it and get a pretty decent cutting edge to make a tool, and or save it for later. It may be a good thing to bring with you if you need to make a more finer artifact, like an arrowhead or a spear point or something later. These are the early stage bifaces found at the Bear Creek site, just a few of them. And you can see the different material types. This is kind of what they look like. It's pretty exciting. Later stage bifaces, now interestingly enough, you find more of these broken because these are the things that get used more, and early stage bifaces become later stage bifaces as people work with them when they're camping, they're hunting, they're fishing, they're using this material. And some of the nicer material, you can see this really nice orange chert that was made, the tip of a projectile point right there out of quartz, and these are the projectile points. This includes both the 2009 projectile points that we found from that secure context under the peat, and then in 2013 we found a few more. We found a tip, which, like I said, isn't really, you can't really say too much about that, but we also found this base under the peat in the western part of the site, and it looks different from these. It's interesting. Once again, that base tells a lot about how old something is, where it comes from, how it was used, and it's finding these two things together isn't as discordant as you'd think. None of these appear to be what we call Clovis points. There was some question when we first found these points, because that concave base is actually similar to what you see in these other fluted points that are associated with the big game hunters who moved across the continent. It doesn't have those channel flakes. And there was some debate. People, you take off your glasses, you see one thing, you put them back on, you see another. These aren't Clovis points. This clearly isn't a Clovis point, but the combination of these two is found in other stone tool assemblages older than 10,000 years up and down the coast. It's called, and into the Great Basin, called the Western Stem tradition. So these are actually more similar to that. And that's, if any of you have heard about what's called Paisley Cave in Oregon, there have been some archaeologists who have been working there recently. And not only have they found projectile points like this over 10, 12,000 years ago, they found preserved poop and sandals and things like that. Very cool, similar assemblage. The one other artifact I wanted to show you, once again, this is like the salmon bone. You got to be careful and not make too much out of it, and yet it's hard not to get excited. This is a piece of graphite. Now, everything I've been showing you for stone tools so far have been chipped stone tools. You take one rock, you hit another, you take a piece of antler, you hit it, and it makes very distinctive kinds of tools, sharp edges. But there's a whole other way of making tools that involves grinding stone, and you don't see that at all, really. I mean, this is still, this is the first site, period, but even other early sites that aren't quite as early, you don't see ground stone tools except over on the east side of the state. So to get a little piece of graphite that has these striations, it's pretty exciting. Now, this environment, you can get, especially on a soft material like graphite, you think about pencil leads and things, it's easy to get those marks naturally. But this edge here has evidence of being sawn halfway and then snapped. And that might not seem like a lot, but that's kind of what we kind of latch onto as archaeologists. By the time you get about 5,000, 4,000 years ago, especially the past couple thousand years in archaeological sites, you see lots of slate artifacts. It just becomes part of the toolkit, and slate is all over the place. It's a good material. You can make a good fish knife, things like that. But how did that technology begin? And up in Alaska, you see this particular kind of marking on slate in some of the earliest archaeological finds. So this might be an indication of some kind of incipient grinding technology. Once again, it's a single sample. This is where I'm always afraid, and this is very timely because there have been a couple big news articles. You might have heard about the early hominin that was found in South Africa. That was on page A3. I guess I made page A1. They keep it local, which is good. But things like that, and also there was in Science, the journals, like a scientific journal, Science, and their popular part of their webpage, there was an article that was entitled, and I'm paraphrasing, like, early humans used oatmeal 8 oatmeal 32,000 years ago, and that was all based on a find in Europe, I believe, of a pestle, like a mortar and pestle, the pestle part, that had the remnants of some oat grains, and that, depending on, you can read way into that, and especially when the press gets a hold of it, it can turn into, from a very interesting find, but just one thing, to suddenly, the people living at the same time as the last Neanderthals were eating oatmeal. So I don't want to go that far, but I just wanted to show you some of the cool things that hopefully, this is just the first site this old that's been found. I'm almost done with my slides here and moving on to the Q&A. This is good timing. Because this really shouldn't be the last one. Now, we don't want to, there are other aspects of archaeology and damage to archaeological sites and things like that. Most of what we find in the Puget Sound area is found during development, during these routine environmental compliance projects like what this one began as. For the longest time, you would see in reports, archaeological reports, about the earliest periods, well, we don't know that much. And glaciers came through and now it's all vegetated, and the oldest stuff that we're going to find is probably underwater in Puget Sound because the ocean levels have gone up and down, mainly have gone up, and so that old stuff would be underwater now on what used to be waterfront property 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 years ago. But you hop one or two valleys inland, like in Redmond or the Carnation Valley, and that stuff is still there. Those areas were underwater as well, but they're still preserved. They're not underwater now, they're just buried under sediment. So it was nice to be able to find something that we hope will be a guide and have this be not a bad cautionary tale, but a good cautionary tale on where to look for more of these sites. Because right now, we've done as much as we can with the analysis. We're doing a little bit more. It's not totally done yet, our project, but we're going to get to the point where we're going to be like, okay, this is what it is. We need to find something comparative. Because we didn't find campfires, we didn't find the places, the dwellings where these people lived, and they clearly did. We were limited to one particular project footprint, and we tried to take a bigger landscape view. This was a really busy area, and it was busy. It's busy now. It was very busy for the past 5,000 years, as we can see in Marymore, and it may not have been busy in terms of the number of people, but people have been here a long time. And I want to end with when at that certain, I hope that you appreciate the fact that knowing the context of how this project happened is really important. So when my contact with the city came out and we were testing and we had just found those projectile point bases, he said, well, what does it mean? I said, well, the site is older than 10,000 years. There were people here who were making and using stone tools over 10,000 years ago. And he said, well, okay, well, what does that mean again? I figured, okay, well, you could conceivably, and once again, you don't want to overstate your case, but you could say, the Chamber of Commerce could put up a sign when you enter Redmond saying that, this community has been here in one form or another for over 10,000 years. It's a great place to live. It was a great place for it's a great place for the native, I live in White Center, so coming up here is a joy. So, the Native American communities, they knew it was a great place to live, and they've lived here, for all these thousands of years, and it continues to be that way. So this has gone on for so long that there are way too many people to thank here necessarily, but I want to thank all of you once again for on a very nice day spending it inside with me. Thank you.